In the heart of Cần Thơ, at the corner of a busy street, sat a modest family shop named Hong's Fix and Goods. It was not quite a repair shop, nor a full convenience store. It offered simple wares, basic mechanical repairs, and was best known for its honest owners, Mr. Hoàng and Mrs. Lành, who had run it for nearly 2 decades. They lived behind the shop in a small home with their 2 teenage children, my age 17 preparing for final exams and Vin, age 13, an energetic boy who idolized his father. Though the shop's profits were meager, the family's warmth and generosity endeared them to neighbors. Mr. Hoàng was known to fix a broken motorbike or patch a tire at little cost for those in need. Life was humble yet content. One balmy night near the end of the rainy season, the family finished dinner in the shop's back room. Rain pattered on the corrugated iron roof, lulling them into a peaceful mood. I helped wash dishes while Vin teased her about school. Mrs. Lành, yawning, tidied the front counter, planning to close early. Mr. Hoàng counted days' earnings and considered the next supply run. Just then, a high-pitched screech tore through the humid air, followed by a deafening crash. Startled, the family rushed to the front entrance. Beyond the shop's open doorway, the street glistened under sputtering lampposts. There, near the curb, lay a motorbike overturned and a man sprawled on the ground, blood seeping from him onto the wet pavement. Horror prickled their skin. A distant motorbike engine roared away, the culprit speeding off. The man moaned faintly, though the sound was strangled. Without hesitation, Mr. Hoàng ran to help. He knelt beside the man, ignoring the gore. "We must call an ambulance," he shouted to Mrs. Lành, who fumbled for her phone. Mai and Vin hovered, eyes wide and hearts pounding. The man's injuries looked dire, his face swollen, limbs twisted unnaturally. Mr. Hoàng tried to staunch the bleeding with a rag from the shop. The victim struggled to breathe, eyes rolling. "Stay awake. Help is coming," Mr. Hoàng urged, but dread coiled in his gut. The man's life ebbed rapidly. Moments later, his muscles slackened. He exhaled a final ragged sigh, eyes unfocused. He was gone. Thunder rumbled overhead. The family stared in shock, water dripping from the shop's awning. When the ambulance arrived minutes later, paramedics found no pulse. They transported the body to the hospital morgue, instructing Mr. Hoàng to wait for the victim's family or authorities. A swirl of sorrow and confusion weighed heavy on the family's hearts. They had done all they could, yet it wasn't enough. For days, Mr. Hoàng replayed the accident in his mind, haunted by the man's final gasp. Why had the driver fled? Who was the victim? After a short investigation, the local police informed him that the man was Mr. Chow, age 40, with no immediate next of kin in Cần Thơ. The authorities struggled to locate extended family. Without arrangements, he was to be buried in a communal grave unless relatives claimed him. Mr. Hoàng felt a pang of pity. He wrote a small note for the local newspaper, hoping someone would come forward. Meanwhile, the shop's routine resumed hesitantly, but the tragedy cast a gloom. People visited the shop with condolences. Mr. Hoàng and Mrs. Lành assured them they tried their best. Each night, I heard her father tossing in his sleep, sometimes muttering, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." She realized he blamed himself for failing to save the stranger's life. Despite encouragement from neighbors, "At least you tried, you did your best," the guilt lodged in his soul. A week later, the man's funeral took place in the communal cemetery on the city outskirts. Mr. Hoàng, feeling responsible, attended. Only a handful of others were present, some local officials, a neighbor who recognized the deceased. A quiet service concluded under a drizzling sky, a simple coffin lowered into damp earth. That evening, back at Hong's Fix and Goods, the family sat in subdued silence, eating a modest dinner of rice and fish. Mr. Hoàng stared at his meal without appetite. Vin fidgeted, trying to lighten the mood with a joke about school, but no one laughed. Mrs. Lành quietly changed the topic, suggesting I finalize her exam revision. The sense of a storm brewing lingered, though none realized the magnitude of what was about to unfold. 2 nights later, around closing time, I was sweeping the shop floor, humming absently. Outside, the neon glow of nearby stores lit the dark street. Mr. Hoàng counted the day's takings at the counter. Abruptly, a slender figure appeared in the doorway. A woman around middle age, drenched from a fresh bout of rain, stepped inside. She wore a worn blouse and carried a small plastic bag of papers. Something about her eyes radiated sorrow.
Xin chào, Mr. Hoàng Polythylene.
We're closing soon, but if you need anything. She cleared her throat. I heard, you tried to save my brother, she said softly, voice trembling. He had an accident outside your shop last week. Mr. Hong's chest tightened. So she was the victim's sister? She introduced herself as Ms. Lu from another province, only just learning of her brother's death. Mr. Hong bowed, offering condolences. Ms. Lu sniffled, gratitude and grief mingling. Thank you for your kindness, she whispered, rummaging in her bag. He would be thankful you tried. I have something for you. She pulled out 3 folded lottery tickets. He bought these the day he died. He was a dreamer. Maybe you can keep them? He left no will, so it's all I can give. Alarm fluttered in Mr. Hong's mind. He insisted it wasn't necessary, but Ms. Lu pressed them into his hands. Please. It feels right that they go to you, she said, eyes shining with tears. You're a good man. Then, with a shaky smile, she turned and stepped out into the drizzling night, refusing further conversation. The family gathered around as Mr. Hong recounted the encounter. He showed them the 3 tickets, each bearing the same set of numbers. They were for this week's draw, scheduled in a few days. Vin's eyes lit up, jokingly exclaiming they might strike it rich. But a weight pressed on Mr. Hong's conscience. Accepting them felt uneasy. However, he rationalized it was Ms. Lu's final gesture of thanks. The tickets remained in a small bowl near the shop's altar, next to a humble statue of Quan Song, a protective figure common in many Vietnamese businesses. None suspected these slips of paper might hold a darker fate than any of them could imagine. That same night, after the shop's shutters came down, the family settled into their routine. Mai studied in her room, Vin played a phone game, Mrs. Lan drifted off to bed early, and Mr. Hong sat alone, replaying the day's events. Eventually, he fell asleep on the sofa near the front counter. A night breeze rustled the street outside. Something in the air felt stifling. As he slipped into slumber, he dreamt vividly. In the dream, Mr. Hong stood outside the shop, the road empty. A figure approached from the gloom, the deceased man, Mr. Chow, wearing the same blood-stained clothes from the accident. His face was twisted, eyes clouded with accusation. He held up the 3 lottery tickets, their numbers swirling in ghostly luminescence. You took these from me, the man rasped. I never claimed them. Now you have them, but at what cost? Mr. Hong stammered, tears welling in the dream. I didn't want them. Your sister insisted. The man's mouth curled in a grim sneer. The street lights flickered, revealing more spectral shapes behind him, shadows of people unidentifiable. Your kindness. Will you regret it? With a roar, the man lunged forward, eyes ablaze. Mr. Hong jolted awake on the sofa, drenched in sweat. The street outside was calm, the shop silent except for the whir of a fan. No ghostly figure. Heart-pounding, he muttered a prayer. Was it just guilt? He forced himself to calm. Tomorrow, life would proceed. He told himself the dream was only a reflection of his stress. But something about the man's ominous question, will you regret it? Lodged in his mind like a thorn. Over the next few days, customers trickled into Hong's Fix and Goods. The lottery draw day arrived. By then, the family had set the tickets aside. They hardly remembered to check them. But Vin, after school, grabbed the results online to see if any matched. When he scanned the numbers, his jaw dropped. Mom, Dad, come see.
Vin irresistently.
He displayed the winning sequence on his phone. All 3 tickets matched the second prize, each worth a sizable sum. The total was unbelievably high for a family who never earned more than basic living expenses. Shock and elation soared. They'd never had such fortune. Initially, Mr. Hong's heart soared with relief. Perhaps the tickets truly were a final blessing from Mr. Chow. Mrs. Lan looked tearful, imagining how they could pay off the shop's mortgage and support the children's education. Mai squealed with excitement at the idea of paying for a better tutor, or maybe even traveling. But amid the celebration, a disquiet echoed. Mr. Hong recalled his grim dream. Are we sure about this? He murmured. It feels too good to be true. Still, practicality overcame caution. The next day, Mr. Hong visited the lottery office. Indeed, the tickets were valid. He completed the paperwork, astonished at their luck. The clerk cut a check that dwarfed any sum Mr. Hong had ever held. The family beamed at the prospect of a brighter future. None could guess that behind this monetary windfall lurked a malevolent presence, one that viewed their excitement with bitter resentment. As the family waited for the money to process, Mr. Hong started making small improvements, renovating the shop's front sign, planning for Vin's extra classes, and even eyeing a second-hand motorbike for Mai. Joy filled the air, as neighbors teased them about their sudden luck. Word spread that they had winning tickets from the deceased man. Some whispered about curses, others joked that fate had chosen them. The family mostly laughed it off. But soon, subtle misfortunes emerged. A few loyal customers abruptly stopped visiting, complaining of nightmares after stepping into the shop. Then, a distant relative of Mr. Hong's was hospitalized after a freak accident. Strangely, the relative had just visited the shop the day before, congratulating them on the winnings. Coincidence? Possibly. Then it escalated. On a Friday evening, while I walked home from a friend's house, a stray motorbike nearly rammed into her at an intersection. She leaped aside, bruising her arm. The driver sped away, eerily similar to how Mr. Chow's accident occurred. Shaken, Mai recounted the incident, tears welling. Mr. Hong's heart pounded with dread. Another near miss. Another echo of that tragic hit and run. He confided in Mrs. Lamb that these coincidences might be connected to the lottery tickets. She dismissed it as paranoia, but her voice wavered. The next day, a neighbor delivered more unsettling news. A second cousin, who had visited and in passing, touched the lottery tickets, fell ill with pneumonia out of nowhere, struggling to breathe. It's probably just the weather, the neighbor said. Yet Mr. Hong felt a creeping sense that something darker was at play. Late that night, in the hush of the shop's back room, Mr. Hong dreamt of Mr. Chow again. This time, the ghost glowered from behind the shop's counter, a rotting hand resting on the lottery tickets. "You took what was mine," the specter hissed, "and all who share in it will suffer." Mr. Hong awoke in a sweat, dread swirling. He couldn't ignore the pattern. The fortunes were entangled with a curse. Despite the growing unease, the family pressed on. They were set to collect the lottery prize in full within a week. They told themselves they'd use it for good, repay debts, fund Mai's college, upgrade the shop. Perhaps overshadowing the bizarre events would be generosity and positivity. But tragedy struck. Just 4 days after the second cousin's pneumonia scare, the cousin's health took a sudden nosedive. By morning, he was declared dead in the ICU, lungs inexplicably failing. Grief slammed the family. They reeled at the abruptness. The doctors had no clear explanation for the swift deterioration. At the funeral, Mr. Hong and Mrs. Lan felt an icy knot in their stomachs. This cousin had indeed touched the lottery tickets and offered mild jokes about them. Was it truly connected? Guilt and fear rooted in Mr. Hong's mind. He turned to the small altar in their home, praying for guidance. Yet each night, he still dreamt of Mr. Chow, the ghost's face distorted by anger, repeating that ominous phrase, "All who share in it will suffer." Word spread in the neighborhood about these suspicious coincidences. Some neighbors began avoiding the shop. The once friendly atmosphere soured, replaced by hushed rumors that the Hong family was cursed, that they had a ghostly debt to pay. Mrs. Lana's eyes grew red from sleepless nights. Mai found her exam performance faltering under anxiety. Vin, who used to be energetic, grew subdued. Afraid yet uncertain, Mr. Hong decided to see if returning the tickets might help. But the official process was already underway. He'd essentially claimed the prize. He considered discarding them or donating all funds to charity. Yet each time he approached the idea, a wave of dread stopped him. It was as if the tickets themselves held him in a chokehold, pushing him toward fulfilling the claim. And so he hesitated, letting the curse tighten its grip. Amid the turmoil, Ms. Lu, the man's sister, reappeared. She arrived at the shop's threshold one humid afternoon, looking gaunt and anxious. Mr. Hong felt relief. Maybe she'd help him unravel the curse. She admitted that strange misfortunes had haunted her since giving away the tickets. She lost her small job, her landlord evicted her. Nightmares tormented her, visions of her deceased brother enraged. She wept, apologizing repeatedly. "I never intended this," she sobbed. "I thought giving you the tickets was an act of gratitude. But something's wrong." Mr. Hong embraced her in sympathy, tears brimming. She asked if they'd encountered misfortunes, and he recounted their eerie chain of accidents and the cousin's death. Ms. Lewis' face paled. They both realized the spirit might remain restless, blaming them for meddling with his final possessions. They conferred about a possible solution. Some neighbors whispered of a spiritual specialist or exorcist who might cleanse cursed objects. Ms. Lu agreed to accompany them. Meanwhile, the lottery office announced the official date for awarding the prize was just days away, the day after tomorrow. With time running short, Ms. Lu insisted they act quickly. That evening, they visited a modest shrine run by an old spiritual woman named Madame Hung, rumored to have dealt with curses. They knelt on woven mats in a smoky chamber, explaining the entire saga.
Madame Hung listen gravely, nodding.
These tickets belong to a soul who died violently, she said. He feels robbed of what might have been his final boon. Such a spirit can become malevolent. She proposed a ritual: place the tickets on a small altar, offer prayers to the deceased soul, apologize for any unintended wrongdoing, and vow to use the money for charitable or beneficial deeds. But a warning loomed: if the spirit's anger was too great, it might not relent. Late that night, the family and Ms. Le gathered at Madame Hung's shrine. The atmosphere was thick with incense smoke and tension. Thunder grumbled in the distance, echoing ominously. On a low table draped in red cloth, Madame Hung laid out bowls of salt, burning joss paper, a small gong, and the 3 lottery tickets. She lit candles, chanting softly in an archaic dialect. Hui Vin Mai, and Ms. Le knelt side by side, hands pressed in supplication. Madame Hung called upon benevolent spirits to witness, guiding the restless soul to peace. She recited the name, Chow, though they never learned his full details. The flickering candlelight cast dancing shadows on the shrine walls. Suddenly, a gust extinguished one candle, plunging the table into partial darkness. Hung's voice grew louder, combating an invisible force. We return these tickets to the realm of the lost. We mean no harm. She signaled Ms. Lu to speak. Ms. Lu sobbed, "Brother, if you're here, please know we do this out of respect. We never sought to steal from you. We release these numbers to you. Forgive us." She bowed low. Mr. Hong added, voice trembling, "I only wanted to help. If this money is your rightful fortune, I beg your forgiveness. Stop harming us." A tense hush fell. The candle flames leaped, casting tall, warped shadows. The tickets fluttered in an unseen breeze. Hung struck the small gong thrice. Everyone flinched at the metallic ring. Then an unearthly moan drifted through the chamber. A voice? Could it be the spirit's lament? But just as they dared hope the ritual was accepted, a foul wind whipped in, scattering the tickets to the floor. Candles sputtered. The overhead lamp flickered crazily. Everyone gasped. Hung struggled to continue chanting, her voice shaking. The sense of presence was overwhelming, a wave of bitter resentment. In a flash, the old woman shouted, "Hurry, pick them up, burn them now." Ms. Lu lunged for the tickets, tossing them into the brazier where joss paper smoldered. Flames erupted, engulfing the thin slips. For an instant, a loud bang reverberated, as if thunder crashed inside. The group cowered, eyes squeezed shut. Then the wind died, leaving a haze of smoke. The tickets' ashes curled in the brazier.
Hương pan tét, sweetie.
I tried, but something resists. The spirit is not appeased. Fear seized them. The exorcism had failed, or partially so. The remnants of the tickets, along with the cursed numbers, might remain linked to them. What now? The next morning, Hung recommended the family make immediate plans to donate any lottery winnings to charitable causes, especially for funeral or hospital expenses, thus severing personal gain. Mr. Hong and Ms. Lu agreed, deciding they'd use every cent to honor the deceased's memory or assist those in dire need. Ms. Lu promised she'd contact charitable foundations. They hoped the spirit's anger might subside if they relinquished all claims. But fate turned darker. Early that afternoon, a neighbor found Vin unconscious by the side of the house. He had taken out the trash and collapsed inexplicably. At the hospital, doctors discovered internal bleeding, though no external injury was apparent. Panicked, the family recognized a horrifying pattern. The spirit was targeting them more directly. Mai, overwrought, refused to leave Vin's side. Doctors scrambled to stabilize him. Baffled, they suspected a rare vascular defect, but Mr. Hong suspected otherwise. He locked himself in a hospital restroom, pressing his forehead against the tiles in despair, whispering, "We're so sorry. Please stop." Tears streaked his cheeks. That same evening, Ms. Lu, returning to her rented room, slipped on a wet tile and fractured her wrist. Another improbable mishap. She texted Mr. Hong, shaken. Meanwhile, messages poured in from acquaintances who had merely touched or congratulated them on the tickets. Everyone seemed to face minor accidents or bizarre losses. The swirl of tragedy was unstoppable. Torn between guilt and desperation, Mr. Hong clutched at any solution. He resolved to expedite the donation plan. The next day, they'd officially collect the prize from the lottery authority. Then they'd funnel it immediately into charitable funds. No portion kept for themselves. A final chance at appeasing the vengeful spirit. Monday dawned, the official claim day for the second prize winnings. Mr. Hong, accompanied by Ms. Lu, traveled to the lottery headquarters. The atmosphere was tense, each step weighted by anxiety. They signed documents, finalizing the sum's release. Some staff congratulated them with forced smiles, oblivious to the gloom. Ms. Lu's bandaged wrist ached from the fracture. Mr. Hong's eyes showed deep exhaustion. The moment the funds were handed over, Ms. Lu and Mr. Hong, in front of witnesses, declared they'd donate everything to an orphanage and a hospital foundation. The staff seemed puzzled, but they followed the instructions. A wave of relief coursed through them as the money was transferred. Ms. Lu insisted on a small portion allocated to a local temple to pray for Mr. Chow's soul. "Finally, it's done," Mr. Hong murmured, hoping the spirit's curse would now relent. But that evening, as the family gathered at the hospital corridor to visit Vin, who had stabilized after minor surgery, the corridor lights blinked. A cold draft swirled. "My," gasped, seeing a fleeting reflection in the stainless steel door at the corridor's end, Mr. Chow's face, twisted in rage. She screamed, dropping a cup of tea. Staff members rushed over, perplexed. The reflection vanished. Alarm spread. Mr. Hong and Mrs. Lan recognized the sign. The spirit was still present, still furious. Despite their donation, the unsettled ghost clung to them. Meanwhile, Vin's condition took a sudden downturn that night. Complications in his bloodstream. Doctors scrambled again. In a panic, Ms. Lu and Mr. Hong raced to the temple where they donated a portion, hoping the monks could do an immediate cleansing ceremony. The abbot, an elderly man named Thay Hung, listened to their frantic pleas. Quietly, he proposed a final definitive ritual. "We must hold a midnight vigil at the place of the man's death," he said. "Summon his spirit to that spot, perform a solemn apology and prayer. Only then might he release you." Midnight. A grim drizzle dampened the street outside Hong's Fix and Goods. The bright shop sign was off, only a faint street lamp flickered. Thay Hung arrived with Ms. Lu, Mr. Hong, and Mrs. Lan stayed at the hospital with Vin, anxiously awaiting results of his crisis. Time was critical. The abbot insisted they do the vigil now, or risk further wrath. They assembled near the curb, precisely where Mr. Chow had collapsed. The abbot lit incense, placing them in a pot anchored to a small stand. He chanted softly, a melodic invocation. The drizzle abated, leaving the air heavy with humidity and tension. Mr. Hong, trembling, recited a heartfelt apology. "Mr. Chow, we humbly beg your forgiveness. We took your tickets unaware of the burden. We vow we do not profit from them. We have donated all in your name. Your spirit is free from earthly ties. Please, relent. Spare my family further harm." Ms. Lu added, voice quavering, "Brother, I never intended to chain you. I only wanted to honor your memory. You have no grievance with these kind folks. Let your anger subside, rest in peace." Thunder rumbled, though the sky was only a faint glow of city lights. A subtle wind swirled the incense smoke. The abbot struck a small wooden bell, chanting a final mantra. Then, from the shadows behind them, they glimpsed an outline, a pale figure standing in the gloom, face half-lit by the street lamp. Fear pulsed in their veins. Could this be the spirit, at last? The figure advanced, watery eyes reflecting sadness. In a breathy whisper, half-audible, it moaned, "I wanted life stolen." The voice trailed off, heartbreak lacing each syllable. The abbot continued chanting, holding out a small talisman. With a final wave, the figure's shape flickered as though dissolving. Then, like a wisp of fog in the morning sun, it vanished, leaving only the hush of night. The incense coals burned low, signifying the end of the ritual.
Slow. Mr. Hoàng and Mrs. Tears streaming.
Ms. Le clutched her bandaged arm, sobbing. I watched, uncertain but hopeful. The abbot lowered his hands, exhaustion etched on his brow. It is done, he declared quietly. The spirit has accepted your remorse. May it find rest. A wave of relief coursed through them. That very hour, back at the hospital, Vin's condition stabilized, the doctors astonished at his sudden improvement. In subsequent days, no new mishaps plagued acquaintances. It seemed the spirit's malice had finally lifted. In the weeks that followed, the family grieved the losses that had occurred, particularly the cousin's death, but found solace that no further calamities befell them or their neighbors. Mr. Hong continued the shop humbly, never quite forgetting the haunting ordeal. The large sum from the lottery fully funded charitable endeavors, as promised, leaving the family's finances modest but unburdened by guilt. In the end, the spirit of Mr. Chow receded into the beyond, appeased by the thorough gesture of returning fortune to the needy and by the heartfelt apology. Though the family's kindness that fateful night had unwittingly invited danger, they reclaimed their lives through acts of contrition and compassion. And every time the memory surfaced, a flicker of an accident on a rainy street, a slip of paper bearing ominous numbers, they murmured silent prayers for the stranger whose final breaths had changed their fate forever.